Well, today we're going to talk about Japan. The chapter is chapter 11, and it's East Asia. And as I normally try to do, is I start with some geography. So that's what we have here, geography. I found this image, I don't know, several years ago. I still use it because I think it helps us understand the size of Japan. It's kind of hard to tell when, it's islands and so far away. Just how big is Japan? It's a group of islands. Can I get you to put the phones away, please? And the earphones? Thanks. It's a group of islands, and of course this geography, like in most places, is critical to understand the history. And I think with Japan that's certainly the case, maybe even more so since it is a chain of islands, and the islands are so far apart. So just to give you an idea about how far apart the islands are, this graphic, this image, places the islands of Japan, and the scale is supposed to be right. I haven't checked it more thoroughly, but I think it's pretty close. Showing you that, for example, the islands run from, Maine, right, all the way down to Georgia, or the panhandle of Florida. Thanks. So you can see there, and those are the four main islands. There are four main islands. So there they are. Honshu, okay, that's the main island. Shikoku, Hokkaido. So, I don't expect you to learn all of the names of the islands, but this gives you an idea that really if you wanted to travel from the southern islands up to the north, that's a long journey. It's like going from the panhandle of Florida up to Maine, southern Maine. There are some smaller islands, a couple smaller ones at least. All told, it's 146 square miles. If you take that and compare it to one of the United States, the one that it comes pretty close to is Montana. So, Montana is one of our larger states. But if that would be taking Montana and stretching it out from, like the panhandle of Florida roughly to southern Maine. Now, of course, a lot of that is mountainous. So while it's 146 square miles, those 146 square miles are not all very usable for farming and for living. Can I get you to put the phones away, please? Thanks. Here's a more traditional look on a map. You can see much the same thing, and then you can notice that there are other smaller islands up here, Kuril Islands. Those are today disputed. In fact, we're not a part of this class, but Russia and Japan fought a war over those islands towards the early 20th century. And then notice the islands extend all the way down, even pretty far south. Notice the proximity then, say modern day, to the territory of Russia, China and North and South Korea. Japan, by its very nature, by its geography, has been isolated. The geography has isolated it because it is a set of islands. But also the people have purposely kept themselves isolated for much of their history. Well, the first record that we have of Japan is actually Chinese record. During the Han Dynasty in the 1st century. How do we read about it? Well, we read about it because the Japanese send tribute to China, to the Han Dynasty.
What does that mean?
Tribute?
Like tribute.
Yeah, tribute, basically, it's, I guess if we were in the mob, we'd call it protection money. Basically, to keep me from invading you, to keep me from doing things to you, you send me a gift. It's sort of a forced gift, right? It's basically showing that Japan was sort of under the influence of China indirectly, and to basically keep the Chinese appeased, they sent gifts, usually money or other objects that are valuable. Okay, so you find it down through history, you find it in a lot of cultures. But it shows, I guess, that the Chinese knew about Japan and that the Japanese were worried about Chinese becoming more involved in Japan, and so they actually sent these gifts, we'll put gifts in quotes, tribute to them. So yeah, that's the word that's usually used of tribute money or tribute gifts. I guess in a context of criminal context, it would be protection money, right? You give me so much money and I won't come in and mess up your business or something, right? It's kind of like that. It is sort of like that, really. All right, so that's our first record of it, and it's in this kind of setting. So obviously the Chinese had had some contact with Japan. The next record that we find is also a Chinese record, but it's in the Tang Dynasty. Remember that we talked about China, I guess it was last week, that China goes through a period of upheaval following the end of the Han Dynasty for about 300 years, and then they've got their own troubles. So before we see them sort of getting involved with the Japanese again, it's not until the 7th century or so. And mainly that had come because when China is powerful, they extend onto the Korean Peninsula. As you can see here in this map of the Han Dynasty, notice that the green of China has extended into North Korea, the northern part of the Korean Peninsula. And so, of course, once you're that far over, then you get more contact with the Japanese. Now, how did the Japanese respond? They didn't like it, and in fact, some of them didn't like it so much that they wanted to try to stop this, right? During the Yamamoto period, Yamamoto rulers in Japan were trying to make plans for the Chinese. And, you know, Japan had its eye on the Korean Peninsula too. So the Korean Peninsula becomes the place where we see China and Japan having conflict, and it's over Korea, because China, of course, wants to control Korea, and at times Japan wants to expand and control parts of Korea. And so since since they're both eyeing that area, they get into turmoil. Yes?
At this time, Korea isn't separated, right?
Korea, yes, it's not at this point, Korea being north and south as we think about it politically. There are different there's a different kingdom in the north. We're going to talk about it later. And there are two kingdoms in the south. So, the distinction between north and south as we think of it today, that happens after World War II. That happens in the late 40s as a result of the end of World War II, and I guess you could say the Cold War. And that has stuck. So still today, technically, North and South Korea are at war. They have never signed a peace agreement. So it's a very, very tense area still today. And U.S. troops still are stationed in South Korea. They've been there since the 1950s. We've had troop presence, especially along the border. I don't see that going away anytime soon either. So, especially the Army. There's an Army presence there. Mostly it's Army. They sometimes send the Navy in for maneuvers and, what do they call them? Exercises, that sort of thing, sort of flex the muscles and let the North Koreans and the Chinese know that we're in the area. So yeah, when I speak of North Korea, I suppose I should say Northern Korea, so we don't confuse it with the modern things. But in fact, there was a kingdom in the north, and the northern part of Korea has had much more affinity and alignment with China over the years than the south. That certainly is true, and it's of course true today. China and Korea. China is about the only country that has significant influence over North Korea even today. Well, anyway, one of the things that the Yamamoto rulers of Japan will do is they will seek to make alliances with free Korean tribes. Some of the Koreans in the northern part of Korea were aligned or controlled by the Chinese, but in the south they were more independent. And so the Japanese said, hey, maybe we can make a deal with those guys, an alliance. The other thing that the Japanese wanted to do was centralize their authority, because Japan had these islands, 4 big islands, 2 smaller islands, then some other even smaller islands, but stretched out, like we said, from, say, the panhandle of Florida to Maine. That's a long ways to try to unify people, especially on islands, especially mountainous islands. Yes?
So they first wanted to try to bring unity or something, or peace, instead of just going right in attack.
Well, when I say centralized authority, I'm saying the Japanese wanted to centralize authority over Japan.
Oh.
To
It was the other way around.
Yeah, to get Japan, if their feeling was, I guess, is that if we could get all the Japanese islands together, we'd be more powerful and we could resist the Chinese, or the Chinese wouldn't think they could come in and, sort of take one island or something, or they have to fight all of us together. That's what I mean by unity.
That makes more sense.
And so they wanted to centralize it. And, ironically, the Japanese are going to use Chinese ideas to centralize Japan to resist China, if that makes sense. Okay, so because China had similar problems. Remember when they had their 300 years of civil war and fighting, they had to then unify. So, by the time we get to the 6th century and into the 7th century, there is a leader who is depicted here with his sons, Shotoku Tashi and his 2 sons. Sometimes people think his sons are actually girls, but those are sons. He was a key leader in Japan, and he was the one who brought about reform to Japan, and like I said, ironically is going to use the Chinese approach to unification in Japan. Why? I guess, well, because it worked, I suppose. The Chinese had unified China, and the Japanese said, well, we would like to unify Japan, so maybe we can learn something from them. So they end up writing a constitution, it's been called, 17-article constitution, written in 604. The 17-article constitution, yeah, that's what it's called. And basically it's just a guideline, a pattern for unification. So this will start them down the road to being more unified. So there are a series of reforms that Japan goes through at about this time, called Takai. Another thing that happens about this time, which again, I suppose you might say is ironic in a sense, is that Buddhism comes to Japan, and Buddhism is actually used by some of the leaders to try to unify the people religiously. But of course, remember, Buddhism is coming from China, even though it was first instituted in India. But Buddhist missionaries, I guess we'll say monks who are carrying out missionary kind of evangelistic, I guess we'd call it, kind of activities, will bring Buddhism to Japan. Some resist it as a foreign or outside religion, which I guess it was. And they said, you know, we don't need this outside religion. We have our own religion. As a result, the Japanese religion will actually become more systematized, because before that it had just been accepted that you would follow the religion of Shinto. But ironically, Shinto is the combination of 2 Chinese words, Shen Tao, which, if you remember when we talked about China, you remember what Tao means? Tao? Way, yes, the way. And so this would be Shen Tao is the way of the spirits. So this highlights the idea that Japanese religion, traditional religion, was a religion of your ancestors, a religion of your dear departed relatives, right? And you're honoring them, and you're calling upon them, you know, to give you guidance or protection, that sort of thing, okay? But it actually gets more organized now, I think, in a way to kind of respond to Buddhism that, hey, we're a real religion too, and that sort of thing. So here is one of the things that you might see in Japan. Out, you see in the water. This is a gate, a gateway, sort of an entrance, even though you see it's out on the water, to remind you of your ancestors and a gateway to the Shinto. So we have this sort of cultural battle going on religiously. Many wanting to stick to the traditional religion of Japan, others latching on to the new Buddhist approach. During the Nara period, which is in the 8th century, 710 to 784, Buddhism is officially encouraged by the government, and in fact, a Buddhist temple, a sort of national temple, is constructed. So here you see a picture of Buddha, very large statue. You see people down here at the bottom. Give you an idea of the scale of this statue. Also at this time, the Japanese imported the Chinese pattern of government, and of course, as we've already mentioned, Buddhism. But the contact with China had its downsides. Remember, we told you, for example, when the Spanish come to the New World, as it's called, they bring with them disease, because the Americas had been isolated from the other continents. You know, we say Europe and Asia and so forth, Africa are different continents. However, all those continents touch one another. People move from Africa into the Middle East, into Asia, into Europe, and so forth. There's a lot of movement between Asia, what we would call Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Europe, because you can just walk there, right? But North and South America, you had to sail there. The same kind of problems that they had in North and South America, they're going to have in Japan. Japan had been separated by water. And when they started having more contact with China, that's going to bring the diseases from the continent onto the islands. And so with that, the Japanese also then have to deal with those diseases. And they will be devastating. Diseases like smallpox and measles and certain kinds of influenza and that sort of stuff. So I guess I just point that out because I want you to realize that what happens in the Americas is not unique. It has happened, it will happen elsewhere. Well, it already had happened elsewhere. Because by the time it happens in North and South America, it's some 700 years after it happened in Japan. Well, the Nara period, they decide to try to centralize things. They don't have everything centralized yet, but they're working on it. They got this centralized government. And we have a new capital at Nara, hence the name of the period, N-A-R-A, Nara period. The leader, following the pattern of other leaders, will want to be considered connected to the gods, that he is connected to the gods, and is often called the Son of Heaven. And of course, they are centralizing the government. and organizing it. Part of the problem was this would work in some of the cities, but remember, Japan is spread out, like we said, from Florida to Maine, and there are a lot of areas in the countryside that are more rural, because there's mountainous areas as well. Those are very difficult to coordinate, to control, to centralize, and so we see especially the nobility of the rural areas are resistive to this kind of centralization. But some progress is made. Assuming if you think centralized government is progressive. But that's maybe a discussion for another day. All right, so we've gotten ourselves up to almost 800 here. The next period lasts quite a bit longer. It's called the Heian period, or sometimes the Kyoto period. This goes from about 800 to about 1200, if you want round numbers. Almost 400 years, a little less. 794 to 1185. And again, a new capital. We're going to see this kind of thing happening. You know, if you're wanting to shake things up, creating a new capital is a good way to do it. When you elect me as President of the United States, I will move the capital. That's why I'll never be elected. I will move the capital away from Washington, D.C. I will pick a spot in the center of the United States for our capital. Probably in Nebraska, Kansas, you know, probably somewhere near, you know, we have the Strategic Air Command, which is near Omaha, probably somewhere out in there. Why? For security reasons. If somebody's going to attack our capital, we need to make them come as far as possible to do it. Don't want them to be able to sail a submarine up right into our waters, which you could at Washington, D.C. So that'll be my logic for it. Not only is it strategic for security, but it's strategic for communication because you're in the center of the country rather than on the fringe, the East Coast. The other, of course, real reason will be is it'll just really anger a bunch of lobbyists and other people. I wouldn't say get rid of Washington, D.C. It would stay as a figurehead. We have all the museums and all the archives, all that stuff there. That'd be fine. Keep that going. But the actual government, the Congress, the Supreme Court, would have to move into a cornfield and do their business there. I'd probably block off a bunch of area and say no one can build there, can't build around it. It's just a government center. Well, anyway, I will never get elected, so you don't have to worry about it. But if you did that, you see what that would do in our culture today. If you ripped the capital away from Washington, D.C. and stuck it out in the middle of nowhere, it would change all the power structures of all these people who have settled around D.C. and Northern Virginia and who have great influence over our government, even though they're not elected. They would now have to decide if they want to try to relocate to Nebraska or Kansas or something out in the middle of a field. They probably would, but they wouldn't like it, which I guess would be part of my plan. Plus, it would take them a while to reorganize, and this would allow a new structuring of the way the government works. And I think that's why they do this. They do it to reorganize things, to shake things up. Just as if I moved the capital from Washington, D.C., it would shake things up. Sometimes why it's called the Kyoto period is that it's near the modern city of Kyoto. Even though the capital at that time was known as Heian. And they developed the Shon system. This system is very similar to feudalism, much like perhaps you are familiar with in Europe. Medieval Europe has a feudal system. Does anybody know what the basis of feudalism, what feudalism is based upon? What's the basic power structure of feudalism? It's based around land ownership, land control, control of land. You know, in Europe you have a king, right? Often a king. The king technically, at least in theory, owns all the land. All the land belongs to the king. And then what the king does, since that's a lot of land, the king is in need of people who will fight for him, an army. You know, when you have a limited population, it's very expensive to have a standing army. The United States at different times, we still have a somewhat of a standing army, although our military is much, much smaller today than what it used to be. Okay? It's much smaller. So what is this feudalism then based upon? It's land, ownership, we need a military. Decentralized. It does somewhat, you know, if you have a powerful ruler, the powerful ruler can use it to their advantage. However, yes, in a sense, what it does is it says, let's say I own all the land, and then I divide it up and I say, okay, 5 of you, yes, 5 of you will be dukes or something, right? So the king will divide it up to 5 dukes. Those 5 dukes will then divide up their land to 5 earls or something. And then the 5 earls will divide it up to 5 counts, right? So then what it is, if I'm the king, I'll say, okay, you get to use that land. You get to profit from my land. But here's what I require of you. You have to be loyal to me. Yes, and you have to provide me an army. You have to, in other words, when I call you, you've got to come. The duke has got to come, and the duke has got to bring the earl's men, and the earl's got to bring the count's men, and so that I can call an army, and within a few days, I can have hundreds of people who will fight for me, but I don't have to pay them. See? I don't have to have them sitting around all the time just waiting for me to need them. They come when I need them. When they come, I don't have to pay them because I've already paid them in advance, so to speak, by letting them use my land. That's the real, if you kind of understand that idea, then you can understand feudalism. Because feudalism has that kind of system. It's sort of a pyramid system, You got somebody at the top, and they divide it into people below, and so it keeps getting more and more and more people, and then I can call all those people to my service. Now, usually it's limited that you only need to serve me so many days out of the year. But most of the time, that's sufficient for me as a king. I don't need a standing army all year long. I only need you when I need you. Then when we're done, you go back home. I don't have to pay you or feed you that time. We've kind of done that somewhat with our military by having what we call Army Reserves, National Guard. You know, these are people that are sort of in the Army, but they're not full-time. Yes?
So they don't really train or nothing? If they're-
Well, a lot of them would train. They would train. They would be required to know how to fight.
So it's like back with the samurai?
Well, the samurais are going to become a part of this. Yes, the samurais are in Europe we call them knights, who ride on horseback and go around that way. In Japan, they would be samurai, riding on horses, fighting with swords and so forth. And a samurai certainly trained for battle. Well, anyway, what are some of the differences? I suppose one would be the estates are more scattered than, say, in Europe because of the islands, the nature of the islands and the mountains. And I suppose the second thing would be a big part of the feudal system in Europe is serfdom. I don't know if we've talked about serfdom. I guess maybe we did. The serf and a slave are somewhat similar, although not identical. A serf is someone tied to a piece of land for their whole life. For your whole life, you're going to work this piece of land. But no one technically owns you, but somebody else owns the land. So then if I own the land, then you are required to work it, and if someone else gets my land, I give it to them or whatever, then you will still work that same piece of land, but you have a different lord, you have a different person who owns the land. So it's not exactly slavery, but it's certainly not freedom either, okay? So I suppose it's a difference only in degree. Maybe technically, but your life is very controlled. Now they don't have that in Japan like they do in Europe. So this Heian period, you mentioned samurai. Here is a picture of a guy who's dressed as a samurai. Pretty imposing, right? Armoring, swords, knives, training, horseback. These are all things that can be used to describe a samurai. The local aristocrats during the Heian period will develop a new military class to keep order. And of course, these are called the samurai, which we could call them a retainer. These are guys who are dedicating their lives to fight. So in that case, they are similar to a European knight. European knights would be trained to fight. Certainly a samurai was as well. The samurai have a distinct code that they follow, a warrior's code. The name of this code is Bushido. A samurai would rather die than be dishonored. This might be something that's a bit foreign to our culture today. I don't know what people are willing to die for today. But these guys are willing to die for even their honor. If they dishonored themselves, they would take their own life. They would commit a ritualistic suicide. Yes, harikari. They would kneel. It was ceremonial. They would kneel down. They would take their sword. They would drive it into their abdomen and move it up and down, back and forth, and then fall over, obviously, and would die pretty quickly thereafter, right? So that's pretty serious business, what I'm talking about. The samurai will continue on, and for hundreds of years until finally government officials want to get rid of the samurai because they are so loyal to this code and they want them to do things, I guess, that would break that code. But that's going to come later. The next period is the shogunate, the Kamakura shogunate. Again, this period lasts about a little less than 200 years, about 150 years. The leader of this, and by the way, a shogun, anybody know what a shogun is in Japan? It's a title. Shogun. Shogun means general. It's a military commander, a general. So shogunate means that the government is going to move under the control of the military. And this is going to be the government in Japan, we see here for 150 years, but then there will be another shogunate later on that'll last for hundreds more years. Well, the leader of this, or the establisher of the shogunate, the Kamakura shogunate, is this man who's drawn here, Minamoto Yoritomo. He's the one that sets up a more centralized power under the shogun or the general and will command or control Japan in this sort of military style. The shogunate system in Japan will last until 1850. 1850. So you can see this kind of system lasts for about 700 years. And I think it explains in a large measure some of the culture of Japan. For example, even at the end of World War II, when the United States, you remember, bombs Japan, and finally Japan surrenders. They do not want to surrender, but they finally do. We will see that the United States will send a general to command Japan. General MacArthur will command Japan, and he will be seen as a shogun of Japan.
So that system was for 700, you said, how many years?
About 700 years, yeah. Well, there's still an emperor, but the emperor is more a figurehead, not the actual power. Kind of like what we see in England today. The queen is still the queen, but the queen is not really the ultimate authority in England anymore. Right? I guess recently, the Prime Minister of England went to the Queen and said, I want to suspend Parliament, and the Queen agreed. But yet, later on, the Parliament said, you don't have the authority to suspend us. Said to the Prime Minister, not to the Queen, but I mean, he had gotten the approval of the Queen. So I guess saying also to the Queen, you can't just suspend us. Well, you can look that up. The bottom line is that it's a figurehead. The emperor is still there. The emperor is very important. The emperor has a lot of ceremonial duties, but the actual power lies with the sort of military. Now, one of the things that will bring great influence on this period will be the Mongols. The Mongols threatened them in the late 13th century. Of course, part of the problem for the Mongols here is that Japan is an island. Japan is, in some cases, you could parallel it with England, I suppose, in that the thing that has been the greatest ally of England over the years has been the water. And same with Japan, the fact that it's a group of islands. So here we see the islands. We can see the territory that's controlled. Notice the proximity to China. The Mongol threat will come under Kublai Khan. Remember, the Yuan dynasty. Kublai Khan demands tribute from Japan. The Japanese refuse. So Kublai Khan decides he will invade Japan. Of course, the Japanese resist. The thing that really seems to be the turning point here is a typhoon. Typhoon is basically a hurricane. In this part of the world, they don't call them hurricanes, they call them typhoons. Same kind of thing that we are pretty accustomed to here in Florida, unfortunately. Huge winds and terrible storms. A terrible storm hit as the Mongols were trying to invade Japan by water. The Japanese will call this wind a wind from the gods, a divine wind, a kamikaze. And so the Mongols do not invade Japan because the storm knocks over their boats and kills a lot of them just in the storm, capsizes the boats. And in fact, no foreigner invaded Japan until the United States did, hundreds of years later. Yes?
Are the typhoons in reference to the El Nino, La Nina typhoons, or that's not something completely different?
These are hurricane-like storms, cyclones.
So it's not because of that phenomenon?
Well, they might have contributed in some way, but I think these happen every year. They happen every year. Much like we get hurricane, we can have a hurricane every year here. Yes?
So like nobody touched them because they thought weather would destroy anybody who tried to attack?
Well, the Mongols were the ones who were the most forceful and the ones who invaded the most. And after the Mongols declined, after this, the Mongols decided not to do it. Why they decided? It was somewhat humiliating to them. Plus, they lost a lot of people. They maybe just thought it's not worth it. I don't know if they thought, well, the Japanese gods got us. I don't know if they had that feeling, but they might have, some of them. So I have a map here I want to show you. I think this is from a National Geographic magazine that shows you the route of the storm. Kind of hard to see, but you see this blue arrow, dotted blue arrow. This appears to be the route of the storm. And then here is the navy of the Mongols as they're coming. Some of them coming from Korea, some of them coming from China, and they get caught in this storm. And of course, the Japanese are also fighting them. But it's a storm is a real turning point then. And in that same magazine, they had this artist rendering of the Mongol fleet being destroyed by the divine wind, or the kamikaze. So you can see, well, you can imagine, like even this past year, the terrible storm that hit the Bahamas. If you imagine being in a boat, a wooden boat, out in that, you would not fare too well, I suppose. Well, there you go. And of course, kamikaze then becomes a word that is used later, as you probably recognize it, when?
World War II.
World War II. And kamikaze is then applied to pilots who are going to fly from Japan to attack U.S. ships. They were called the kamikaze pilots because they were to be the divine wind, so to speak, to protect Japan from the United States. But part of the thing is, you know, if you have a plane, the plane has a maximum distance it can fly, depending on its fuel usage and its fuel capacity. Well, you can double that range if you never intend on coming back. So let's say you can fly 250 miles or 300 miles, and then you have to come back 300 miles. You can now fly out 500, 600 miles if you don't intend on coming back. And that's what these guys were. They were basically suicide bombers, I guess, in the air. They would go through a tea ceremony, they would get in their planes, and they would fly knowing they were never coming back. They were loaded up with torpedoes and bombs on their planes, because they're small planes, and they would just fly their plane right into U.S. ships. The U.S. would be shooting at them, and they just kept coming, and their goal was to fly into the ships. And of course, their bombs would explode, and they hoped that they would sink the ships that way. So that's a hard thing to defend against. So they earned the name then of kamikazes, or divine wind. And this is where it comes from, referencing back to the fleet that was destroyed here. Well, we see the Ashikaga period, 1313 or 1333 to 1600. Here the Mongol pressure put strains on the new shogun because there's still pressure there. So a new shogunate arises, the Ashikaga shogunate. Central government is reduced somewhat, and the local aristocracy is given more power. And that will last until, there will be a civil war that breaks out in the 15th century. It's called the Onin War. But the Ashikaga shogunate survives, although weakened. All right, we want to move on now to Korea. Here is a map of Korea. Of course, it is not an island, it is a peninsula with this is the modern border with China, very long border with China, a lot of mountains. Korea is pretty far north, so they have some real winter there. It's not tropical by any means. It's about the size of Minnesota. And it does come under the control of the Chinese from time to time. As China is powerful and it expands, one of the places it normally expands is at least to the northern part of the Korean Peninsula. During the Han Dynasty in 109, this is the time that the Chinese control the northern part. As the Han Dynasty declines, Korea gains more independence. And in fact, as I alluded to earlier, what will emerge in Korea are three distinct kingdoms. These three kingdoms will be divided, one in the north, basically two in the south for the most of the time period. So we see these kingdoms from the 4th to the 7th century. The kingdoms themselves will kind of fight amongst themselves. There'll be rivals to see who will gain power, who will gain territory. But basically the kingdom in the north is called the Korguryu. Since it is in the north, of course, as you would expect, it has the most influence from China. Buddhism arrives in this area in the 4th century AD. And in fact, they even follow the teachings of Confucius. And they have a Confucian academy. This is the way in which the government is controlled. In fact, civil servants in China have to pass the test. And it's a test. The civil service exam is basically a test over Confucius. The capital will be at Pyongyang. So this is sometimes called the period of the three kingdoms in Korea. Here's a map that shows you the Korguryu kingdom at the height of its expansion. And notice that they control much of the peninsula pretty far south. Of course, this is when they're at their height of their power. You can also see the other two kingdoms in the south that we're going to talk about. Well, Korea is a very mountainous area. In the southwest part of Korean Peninsula, the Pakche, and the southeast, Silla. These have much less influence of China because they are obviously further away from China, more isolated from it. You can see this is a picture of the landscape of the southern part of Korea. Fertile lands, but also mountains. Silla, first, is the weakest state, but it will grow and come to dominate much of the peninsula. But of course, it suffers, as many of these areas do, with the infighting of aristocrats. Eventually, we'll see that the king of Silla will be assassinated in 780, and Korea goes through a period that we might call a civil war. So Korea, I mean, we look at Korea today and we say, isn't it too bad, we might say, that Korea is divided, that Korea is not unified. But in fact, you're pretty hard pressed to find a time that the Korean Peninsula was unified under one government. There has been division there for much of their history. Well, after the Civil War period, we do see the emergence of the Koryo dynasty, which you can see lasts for about 400 years. Koryo is where we get the name Korea. Taizhou is the founder, and again, it is based upon a Chinese sort of model of government. With Buddhism and Buddhist monasteries being used to sort of unify the people. And in 1200, a military government arises with kings as figureheads. So again, similar to what we just saw in Japan with the shogunates, where the government is controlled by the military. So you can see in the map here, Goryeo and the other two kingdoms and the area in which they will expand. Also during this period, there will be times when the Japanese try to take control of Korea when Japan is strong. Well, the Mongols attacked Korea as well as China to take control of it, and the Koryo dynasty comes under the Mongol authority. One of the things that the Mongols forced the Koreans to do is to go up into their mountains, to cut down trees, and to build ships for them. Yes?
So when Korea was under the control of Han, but yet they noticed that the Han declines, why do they continue to follow that model of government if they notice that it's going to decline again?
Yeah, well, you know, I think the model of the government trying to centralize, that's what I mean. That's what I'm talking about. And they want to have a centralized government if possible because they are also divided. Those who wish for centralized government look to models that have been centralized. So, well, the Koreans get involved in the invasion in Japan indirectly because they are forced to build ships and cut lumber so that the Mongols can try to invade Japan that we already talked about. Obviously, that did not work, and so we see that the Mongol power will decline, and with it, so too, the Koryo dynasty will decline. A new dynasty will emerge a few years later. It will be known as the Yi dynasty. The Yi dynasty, which will last, as you can see here, for about 230 years, brings local control of Korea. Here we see the countryside. Here we see some young ladies in traditional dress of the area. Well, we have just a couple of slides here I want to finish, and those are about Vietnam. So let me do that. I'll put all of them up here at once so you can see it. Vietnam, as we've already mentioned before, the Chinese, in a similar fashion, come and control the northern part of Vietnam when China is strong. When they are weak, then the Vietnamese control themselves more locally. The first control is under the Qin dynasty, around 200 BC. When Qin falls, Vietnam is independent briefly and then returns to Chinese control under the Han dynasty around 100 BC. And the Chinese maintain a great amount of influence in Vietnam, especially in the north. So here you see a map of the area and the control that's there. And here's our last screen. The local Vietnamese control, we still have 2 minutes, by the way. For those, we pack up early and we come in late, so we only get so much time in here. So I try to keep to the time, but we still have a couple of minutes. I know you're eager to go to wherever you're going. Well, let me finish this out. The Chinese Vietnam, they call it Dai Viet, or the Great Viet. And in fact, they battled to try to control all of Vietnam for many centuries, but those in the south part of Vietnam, along the Mekong Delta, the Champa, will resist them. The Chinese want total control, but they fail. The Chinese finally are pushed out in 1428, and Vietnam comes under local control of the Champa in 1471. All right, we'll end it there.
Can you put the Yi dynasty back up there so I can get a picture?
Sure. Yeah, that's it.